to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to our panel to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. Today, I'm asking, as countries around the world cope with COVID-19, why are some media still criticizing China's efforts and political system? Why not focus on what might work from China's experience in their own battles against the virus? Here's why I'm asking. COVID-19 is spreading around the world and spreading fast. Worldwide, over 125,000 cases have been reported in 118 different countries, territories and areas, according to the World Health Organization, or WHO, as of Thursday. We see cases erupting from Thailand to Togo, from Brazil to Belarus, and alarming spikes in Iran, the Republic of Korea and Italy, which now has over 12,400 cases. Outside China, the death toll has reached 1,440. The WHO on Wednesday officially declared the disease a pandemic, meaning a worldwide spread of a new disease for which most people do not have immunity. The situation has reached a new level of gravity. China has been battling the bulk of the cases so far, but in recent weeks the situation has been stabilizing. The number of daily new confirmed cases keeps dropping and has stayed in the double digits over the last week, according to China's National Health Commission. And on Thursday, China only reported 8 new cases. Now, President Xi Jinping visited Wuhan on Tuesday, where he acknowledged that China's COVID-19 prevention and control efforts have turned the tide. The peak, according to a government official on Thursday, is over. The progress isn't due to sheer luck, of course. China has taken Herculean measures to fight and prevent the spread of this disease. Lockdowns, quarantines, specialized hospitals, mobilized medical teams, military transport planes. Slowly, people are able to go back to work, production is revving up again, and Beijingers are even happy to see traffic clogging the streets once again. Of course, some media have called China's efforts draconian, heavy-handed, autocratic, but we call them effective. And even now, when countries around the world are facing this new adversary, some media are still intent on painting China as the villain. In today's Headline Buster, I want to know, in their COVID-19 coverage, are media barking up the wrong tree? And my first example comes from the New York Times, and it was published early March, when it says China may be beating the coronavirus at a painful cost. The piece says Beijing says its heavy-handed measures are working. Can other countries battling the outbreak learn from its efforts, or is the cure worse than the disease? The headline is misleading, according to me. Although it asks, can other countries battling the outbreak learn from Beijing's efforts? Clearly, the journalist has no intention of really exploring this question, as she doesn't do in the article. She's already decided, it seems, that for the reader, the answer is a resounding no. Only once does the piece even bring up the issue, when it says countries studying China's approach would need to consider how it has upended nearly every corner of Chinese society, instead of talking about what other countries could apply to their own situations. However, the piece uses the question to springboard into all kinds of criticism of China's system. China's campaign has come at great cost to people's livelihoods and personal liberties. Even countries that could copy China still have to ask whether the cure is worse than the disease. The article repeats. I just want to ask, how else do you stop the spread of a contagious virus, especially when you do not know how deadly it could be, especially when you see what happened in Wuhan? The journalist is fair to ask such a question, but she should have informed herself first. The article also tries to pull the trick of saying Beijing says its heavy-handed measures are working, and China says it has the answers, when, if you actually read the article, it's the World Health Organization who are saying this, not China itself. The WHO says China's containment measures may have saved hundreds of thousands of people from infection. Its efforts show that uncontrolled spread of the virus is not a one-way street, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the group's Director General, said on Thursday. There is no question that China's bold approach to the rapid spread of this new respiratory pathogen has changed the course of what was a rapidly escalating and continues to be a deadly epidemic. Dr. Bruce Aylward, the leader of the WHO mission that visited China, and he told reporters in Beijing late last month. And now, as the virus affects people in industries all over the world, from stock markets to tourism to the global supply chain, maybe people do want to know what could be taken from China's experience. Maybe now is the time for a little less ideology and a little more pragmatism. One last point here. Now, when the New York Times tweeted about China's lockdown, they focused on how the strict restrictions were coming at great cost to people's livelihoods and personal liberties. But when it comes to Italy's lockdown, the language totally shifts. In this case, Italy is risking its economy in an effort to contain Europe's worst coronavirus outbreak. More heroic than authoritarian, won't you say? The double standards are glaring, especially when these two tweets come minutes apart. Our next piece appears in the Wall Street Journal. Democracy, Dictatorship, Disease. The West takes its turn with coronavirus. It was published on March the 8th. Now, despite the melodramatic headline, the article makes some interesting points, however, I have to be fair. It opens by saying many epidemiologists and experts warn that drastic measures of the kind deployed in China and imposed in large parts of northern Italy on Sunday morning, measures that are so far opposed by President Trump, are now overdue. Overdue, that's the word used. Here we see experts' endorsement of China's so-called drastic or draconian measures that many politicians seem to dismiss, at least initially. But over the last week, things have started to change. Italy has locked down the whole country. Schools and universities begin to close across Europe and the United States. A containment zone has been set up around a hard-hit suburb of New York City. The NBA suspended the rest of its season. Healthcare systems are ramping up testing. It seems that finally, governments, businesses, individuals are starting to take note. Even if countries don't carbon copy China's measures, we see how some efforts can be adapted and customized for each country's system. The Wall Street Journal article adds, back when the epidemic was mostly limited to China, many Western politicians focused on the initial failings in Wuhan, asserting that the free flow of information in democracies will give them a natural advantage during a massive public health crisis. What is becoming evident now, however, is that such knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into meaningful action. Clearly, viruses don't care about your political systems. I only wish I could say the same about some media. So, is it even possible to report on the topic without turning political? I found a rather refreshing answer on Science, the publication by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The headline from March the 2nd says, China's aggressive measures have slowed the coronavirus. They may not work in other countries. The article starts by describing some of the positive results coming out of the February 28th report released by a mission organized by the WHO and the Chinese government, and why the number of new cases reported each day has plummeted during the past few weeks. It also acknowledges that some experts had doubts about so much encouraging news before going to China, but says the experts agreed with the report when it says the decline in COVID-19 cases across China is real, and China's bold approach to contain the rapid spread of this new respiratory pathogen has changed the course of a rapidly escalating and deadly epidemic. The article actually follows up on its headline when it says, the question now is whether the world can take lessons from China's apparent success and whether the massive lockdowns and electronic surveillance measures imposed by an authoritarian government would work in other countries. Fine, call China's system whatever you want. But the article says China's methods might not work elsewhere, but it doesn't say they won't work because the Chinese government is authoritarian or whatever the way you want to call it. Instead, The piece focused on analysis from experts without editorializing or pushing an agenda. The overarching idea is summed up in the final paragraph by the World Health Organization expert when he says, we're getting new reports daily of new outbreaks in new areas, and people have a sense of, we can't do anything. Well, sorry, he says. There are really practical things you can do to be ready to be able to respond to this, and that's where the focus will need to be. So, instead of using COVID-19 as one more opportunity to bash China and its system, why not focus on the global fight against this new threat? Let's all fight the virus the way you want, whatever you call it, but let's focus on the virus instead of each other. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I'll open up the floor to my panelists to ask them, are the media fighting the wrong fight in their COVID-19 coverage so far? And as the virus spreads, are media reports changing their tune? Back to Headline Buster, I'm asking my panelists, are media covering COVID-19 fairly, especially when it comes to China's measures, which have been labeled draconian, heavy-handed, authoritarian? We've seen countless reports attacking China's methods and political system instead of pragmatically exploring what from China's efforts might work in other countries. But now the virus is spreading, are media changing their approach? I'm pleased to be joined from London by Professor Daya Thussu, Professor of International Communication at Hong Kong Baptist University. I'm also joined on the line by Zoon Ahmed, Research Fellow at the Belt and Road Strategy Institute of Tsinghua University in Beijing, and Professor Xiang, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, also in Beijing. Many thanks for your time. Now, it's been interesting watching this story while living it, and now we're watching the story unfold around the rest of the world, always with a heavy heart. But it seems that the attacks on China's political system and efforts persist. So, Professor Thussu, do you agree? Are you also seeing it that way? Help us understand why some media have been casting the Chinese government as the enemy instead of the virus.
Thank you for having me on this program. There is obviously a perceptive shift in the way the China story is being covered in international media, but the underlying tone still remains basically anti-Chinese. The examples that you discussed in this program today are not isolated examples. You can have, and you picked up American publications, but you can look at Le Monde, you can look at Spiegel in Germany, you can look at The Guardian here in London. The tone and tenor of the coverage is not very different. But you see, we're talking about the elite media, a media which has very educated readership and therefore global influence. I think the situation is much worse with the popular media, popular newspapers, popular television programs, and even worse on social media, where the debate has continued to be focused on, all kinds of misinformation. Although in the mainstream media, because of the changing situation, the fact that it is a global emergency now has changed, and people are increasingly asking, maybe we need to look again at how the Chinese dealt with it. Because as you mentioned in the program, the new figures of infected people in China have come down to single digit, which is an extraordinary achievement. So it's not surprising if policymakers, even journalists, many journalists are thinking about we should look back and see how the Chinese dealt with it and how they're dealing with it.
Briefly, Professor Thussu, what do you think are the most important reasons driving this kind of undertone of reports, not just in elite media or popular media or social media?
Well, it's we're getting to the realm of politics, geopolitics in this case. The Economist magazine here has a cover story about, it's called Politics of Pandemics, so it's has to be seen within that context. There is actually a Cold War going on between the United States and China for several months now, if not years, and this is an episode within that bigger picture And therefore it is not surprising that a certain anti-Chinese framing is going to be there. And if you look at how the coverage here, in international media was, I mean, it was tinged with a huge amount of racism. We saw in earlier reports about China, the notion of Chernobyl was invoked. It was described as China was described as real sick man of Asia. So it's part of a narrative which has deep political undertones, and that's part of a bigger geopolitical battle.
Zoon, how do you look at some of the factors driving these negative reporting, negative imaging of China, especially on popular media or social media?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. I'll start with agreeing with Professor Daya that definitely this kind of reporting, this coverage has deep political, geopolitical, and ideological undertones. So for mainstream Western media outlets to cover China through this lens that they are ademocratic, they are against basic freedoms of the individual. All of this came into play when China had to take some very decisive measures to control the spread of the virus. Now, the thing is that when we talk about social media, of course, the subtlety sort of goes away, and then you have a plethora of doctored videos. We had so many text messages that were trying to cover China in a very negative light. Like there were some videos about how China is gunning down people that are infected by the virus. And the problem is that on social media, there is absolutely no filter. People circulate what they feel is very dire, and there's someone creating this content. That's the actual problem. So there's real interest behind fueling this perspective, this perception about China. And I think the fact that after so many weeks, now the public of these countries that were initially very critical about China's measures, that were talking about the individual freedoms of the people that were going through this period of quarantine, of lockdown, today they realize that their governments are actually not doing enough. And it really took that shift of China being able to address the problem of COVID-19 versus their governments not being able to take some of those decisive measures, or at least, I mean, the hypocrisy of how they were viewing China versus what they're having to do, and to some extent failing to do, is becoming apparent to some of the people in the public. So so definitely we see with the success of China, given that now we are in single digits of new cases, we know that this was a successful case. And this experience in itself, I hope that it also makes people realize that the coverage about China, the perception that's being spread about China is very agenda driven. And I hope that this can help people to understand, to take what they're being told with a pinch of salt.
Professor Liu Xiang, from China's perspective, how much pressure has it been under since the start of the virus, since the start of the outbreak in Wuhan, and then later the very strong, very stringent measures that it took, and now things are getting better, and yet it seems that the criticism just persists. What kind of pressure has it been under China, and how much can China do really to speak back, to speak up and say, you might be right in some of what you're saying, but that's not the whole picture? How much is China doing at this moment?
Hi, Liu Xiang. I'm very glad to join the discussion. First thing I want to say, we are now, I'm very happy to see that we are seeing the beginning of the end of this total war against the coronavirus in China, but very unfortunately, we see the long existing ideological bigotry in some foreign countries, even some ill intentions. I want to stress one point. Beyond the ideological bigotry, actually we see some very ill-intentioned mindset about competition. You may remember what very high-ranked U.S. officials said when we were in very difficult times. That's the late January. The Secretary of Commerce of the United States said, okay, the virus in China could be good for U.S. jobs, for the American jobs and manufacturing. So it's a mindset that's very ill-intentioned. And then now what we are doing is, first of all, is to fight, to continue our fight against the virus. And we are seeing the victory very soon. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that we are the Chinese government and our community of scientists should share our experience and lessons to other countries that are infected, to all those countries who have the same virus.
Yeah. So I want to focus on the potential consequence of this kind of atmosphere against, in public opinion, international public opinion against China. And I don't want to focus on the consequences for China, the Chinese government, or the Chinese people. I don't want to focus for the international general public, for the general public in those countries that are finding the virus at their doorstep. Professor Thussu, what do you think has been the consequences of this kind of misinformation about China, which probably could have been avoided if people would have taken information coming out of China through the official or authoritative channels a little bit more seriously?
When it was the worst situation in China in February and late January onwards, it was a sort of localized story for the rest of the world, and the focus was on censorship and suppression, etc. Today we are in a very different situation. It is a global emergency. As the British Prime Minister reminded people yesterday, that it is the worst public health emergency in a generation. And the German Chancellor mentioned a couple of days ago that a majority of Germans might be infected by this dreadful virus. So, it is a global emergency. It's gone beyond China now. And I think in terms of the role of communication more broadly, and media in particular, it is imperative that there is a kind of international agreed do's and don'ts list. The World Health Organization and organizations such as those have to, think seriously about creating an international agreed formula about how to communicate, because in the absence of that, there are lots of fake ideas and misinformation circulating around the world and creating panic and fear psychosis, which is actually quite dangerous for the world at large, not just any particular country. So it's a global problem. It needs global solutions.
Zoon, what do you think has been the consequences of the persistent mistrust or bad-mouthing about China or Chinese efforts that are really backfiring in some domestic populations in the West?
Well,
it is to some extent.
Sorry, yes.
Sorry.
To Zoom, please.
Yes, okay. Well, I mean, as I earlier also mentioned, on social media, we see that slowly people are realizing that there was an innate bias in the kind of coverage or the kind of misperceptions that were being spearheaded about China. So I think the impact of this entire experience can be that people can take what they're told with a pinch of salt. I think they can be more critical about the basic underlying agendas of the media that they traditionally have learned to trust. And I hope that when, in the coming weeks, when China can play a very positive role in setting not only an example, but actually helping countries overcome the challenges that they're facing today after being successful domestically, it can really make people think that humanity is one against a challenge. I truly believe that the negative consequences are short-term, but we can come out of this as a stronger people that can realize that we are all threatened by similar issues. We have to move beyond, as you mentioned, ideological discourse and be more pragmatic.
Yeah.
Think about the price of just individual freedom versus thinking of the betterment of humanity and society. So I'm hopeful that we will come out of this stronger.
I certainly hope so. China has been talking about the idea of a global community of a shared future, and just earlier today I was reading the tweet from the Director General of the World Health Organization, and he just tweeted one sentence: "We're all in this together." So in front of a shared adversary, our connectivity, you know, our interwoven fate, let's say, is even more obvious. But on the part of China, Professor Liu, what could have China done better to either make its information more interesting, more accessible, or give people more confidence in what it has been doing? Is there anything that China could have done better?
I think in the very beginning, the local government did something wrong, or they were confused about by the virus because they didn't know what the virus was really, what kind of this virus. They don't know exactly what kind of this virus it was. And after they discovered the nature of this virus, they shared many information with the international community, especially through the mechanism of WHO. And we also share our information with some certain countries, like the United States. But unfortunately, some governments, like the United States, didn't pay much attention to that. They only focus on the ideological or battles. So now what we can do, I think, actually I think our government is doing quite well now in sharing the information. What we can do better, I think we should have more news coverage about that. And the real problem is not on our side. It's on the media of the other countries, how they could cover the situation in China in a better way.
Okay, we have to leave it there. It's a very complicated situation, needs a lot of discussion, and all sides can probably do better. I thank Professor Daya, Thussu joining us from London, Zoon, Ahmed joining us in Beijing, and Xiang also in the Chinese capital. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Headline Buster. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.